The first time Evan's mother called me a commoner, I was holding a crystal flute that wasn't mine and trying to remember which fork they'd put closest to my plate. The second time, a uniformed officer was asking me to step aside and explain why my name wasn't on a list I had been told not to worry about. For weeks later, those same parents were whispering please to me in a church parking lot with the local news van idling by the curb, but I'm getting ahead of myself. It started on the first Friday of the month, warm for early fall in Georgia, with the Braves game humming from every bar TV along Canton Road and my phone face down on a stack of graded essays. I teach 11th grade English at the public high school, and that evening I was in my friend Dana's backyard in Marietta, nursing a paper cup of sweet tea at her HOA's monthly potluck. Evan had been a parent volunteer in my classroom the spring before, helping juniors fill out scholarship forms. We'd bumped into each other all summer at community events, exchanged small talk over folding tables and lukewarm coffee. And finally, he'd asked if I wanted to catch a movie. He told me his parents were old Marietta with strong opinions but good hearts, and I told him my mother still collected church bulletins like they were baseball cards, and my father measured his week by how many miles he walked the dog before sunrise. We went slow, dinner twice, a matinee, breakfast burritos at the food truck off Roswell Road, and then he said something that should have been a bigger warning than it felt at the time. My mother's having a birthday thing, he said that Friday, standing under a string of patio lights while the HOA president tried to quiet a debate about mailbox paint colors. Not a party, exactly. More like a multi-course dinner with strangers who will become your new best friends if you survive dessert. That sounds like a trap, I said, smiling because I thought he was joking. It's only a trap if you step in it, he said, and I noticed the way he didn't quite meet my eyes. I want you to come. I've told them about you. Don't dress up too much. Mom gets competitive. I wore a navy dress I could teach in and a simple necklace my grandmother left me. The second weekend of the month, Evan picked me up in a car that barely made a sound and drove us through a gated entrance where the guard waved at him like they'd been chatting for years. The driveway curved for what felt like a quarter mile, polished stone at every turn, and when we walked into the house, the air smelled like eucalyptus and lemon polish. The dining room had more glass than a museum. I counted 9 place settings. Someone had set menu cards at each seat, and mine said Maya, guest. Everyone else's had a last name. It was a small thing, but it didn't feel small. His father introduced himself with the smoothness of a man who never waited for a table in his life. He ran a chain of high-end dealerships. I knew that much from local ads. His mother, Vivian, was the type who chaired every charity luncheon and sent follow-up emails about seating charts at midnight. She wore a silk blouse the color of a robin's egg and a smile that never touched her eyes. Evan kissed her cheek and grinned at me like now would be a good time to say something charming. I told her her home was beautiful, which it was, and she tilted her head in that way people do before they compliment you with a knife. What a lovely dress, she said, eyes sliding to my shoes. I adore pieces that are versatile. For the classroom and for dinner. Practicality is varying this year. I felt the first spark of heat under my collar, the kind that doesn't show on your face, but tightens your shoulders. I figured if I spill anything, I said lightly, I can grade it as extra credit. Evan touched my elbow, a quick squeeze. Mom, Maya's the one I told you about, runs the book drive, got half my softball team into the reading program. Vivian nodded as if she were trying to place me in an old yearbook. Right, the community teacher. Evan said your heart is enormous. That's what matters when one doesn't have other advantages. She looked past me. Darling, did the florist deliver the peonies? I said peonies, not hydrangeas, and if they brought hydrangeas again. I told myself I was reading into things. People say clumsy things in groups. The first course arrived, and someone made a toast about legacies, and we passed plates like we were in a magazine. By the main dish, the conversation turned to housing. That was when Richard, his father, leaned back and said something I can still hear plain as the chime of their grandfather clock. "Evan's always been kind," he said, cutting his steak with slow, perfect strokes, and kindness is a luxury. But pairing smart choices with smart circles, that's what builds a life. We've worked hard to keep our kids from having to learn certain lessons the hard way. I don't mean any offense, he added, looking straight at me. It's just that our world is delicate. Not everyone understands how to move through it. The room got very quiet. Evan started to speak. Vivian rested a hand on his arm and smiled at me. "We adore the people who keep communities stitched together. Teachers, nurses, church ladies. Salt of the earth." I told Evan it's sweet to have a phase where you appreciate simpler company. We all had one. I dated a drummer once. I outgrew it. I set my fork down because my hand had started to shake. "I'm not a drummer," I said, almost laughing because if I didn't laugh I would say something I couldn't take back. "I'm a woman he's been seeing for a month." "And you're very brave," she said, "syrup without sugar. Most people would be too intimidated to be here." The crystal flute slid a little in my hand as a server refilled it. I could smell the seared beef and the citrus from the salad and the faint perfume the woman to my left had dabbed at her neck. My palms got sticky. Evan cleared his throat. "Mom, Dad, stop. Maya's not a prop. We're not in high school." Richard's smile dropped a fraction. Vivian's did not. "We are only saying," she said pleasantly, "that we want your future to match what we've provided. People can be very nice, Evan, very sweet, and still be common." "Do you know what I mean, Maya?" "I'm sure you do." The word sat there like a pebble in the dish. Common. I took 2 sips of water and felt my throat dry anyway. The server hovering at my shoulder pretended not to hear, the way good staff learn to save families from themselves. I looked at Evan and waited for him to say something that would make this a misunderstanding. He didn't. He looked small in a room built to make him look large. I excused myself on the pretense of calling my dog sitter and stood in their back hallway by a table stacked with fundraiser brochures. The air back there was cooler, no perfumes or candles, only the clean smell of floor wax. On the hall table sat a glossy booklet for Vivian's nonprofit, the Brookstone Promise Foundation, with photos of smiling kids and a list of legacy sponsors. I recognized some names from our school board meetings. I also recognized the Dalton family's name printed twice, once as founding benefactors and once as pro bono advisory, with a tax identification number below it that made my lawyer friend's voice in my head say, "Interesting." The booklet mentioned a food pantry they supported, the one where I spend Saturdays loading boxes into trunks, while the local news runs feel-good segments about donations that come in at holiday time and go quiet by February. I ran my finger over the tiny print and felt something I didn't want to name yet. When I returned, dessert plates were being set down, and Vivian led a conversation about a Sunday church picnic her committee was hosting on the 3rd weekend of the month. "We do all the heavy lifting," she said, folding her cloth napkin with surgical precision. "It's amazing how people flock to things when they see our family name on the program. Blessings draw blessings." "Maybe blessings are supposed to go to people who need them," I said, almost to myself. "What a darling sentiment," she said and smiled at Richard as if we were trading recipes. Evan drove me home in near silence. In the glow of the dashboard, I could see him struggling to form a sentence that would fix the evening. When he pulled up to my apartment, he killed the engine and stared at his hands. "They can be a lot," he said. "They keep score. It's a sport to them." "And what is it to you?" I asked. He winced. "A fight I mostly lose unless I plan the attack. I wanted you to see where I'm from before I tell them what I'm choosing." You invited me to be a warning label? I said, feeling the slow burn rise from the base of my neck to my ears. So when you tell them you're dating someone with a teacher's salary and a used hatchback, they'll already have said the quiet part out loud? That's not fair, he said softly. I brought you because I like you. That's on me, I said in a voice that surprised me with how steady it was. I opened the door and felt the cool night air on my face. Good night, Evan. We didn't speak all week. I graded essays, sat through a PTA meeting on the second Tuesday, parents arguing for 20 minutes about snack guidelines like it was federal policy, and signed up for the pantry shift that coming Saturday because doing something useful steadied me. On Wednesday night, my mother called to remind me of the church bake sale the last Thursday before payday. On Thursday morning, the local news ran a segment on the Brookstone Promise Foundation's Sunday picnic, Vivian on camera in a tailored dress talking about serving our neighbors with dignity. I turned off the TV without finishing my coffee. Evan texted Friday afternoon, please come to the picnic Sunday. Let me make this right. I ignored him. He texted again, please. They'll behave. I promise. I stared at the message. I could hear Dana in my head saying, don't give them a second audition. I could hear my grandmother, too, the woman who taught me to can tomatoes and to stand up straight, saying, sometimes you let people show you twice, so you never doubt what you saw the first time. Against my better judgment and probably because forgiveness felt easier than anger that day, I texted back 1 hour. I'm bringing canned goods. The Sunday church lawn was strung with bunting and folding tables piled with sandwiches and store-bought cookies. The air smelled like sunscreen and barbecue smoke. Children ran in packs, grass stains on their knees, while an older man tuned a guitar near the gazebo. A Braves cap perched on the head of the pastor I knew from the food pantry, and he waved me over with a grin. Maya, right on time. Bless you. He took the bags from my arms. You always bring the good stuff. I brought what was on the pantry list, I said, cheeks warming because compliments from people who actually did the work hit different. Evan found me by the potato salad and looked like he hadn't slept. He reached for my hand. I put my phone in that hand instead. He took the hint, but didn't leave. Vivian and Richard circulated like they were at a gala and everyone else just happened to be wearing shorts. Vivian spotted me, her expression tightening before smoothing out into something philanthropically neutral. You came, she said, tone light. How lovely. If you don't mind, we could use help at the water table. Our regular volunteer couldn't make it. I came to drop off donations, I said. I'm staying for 1 hour. She moved closer, lowering her voice so only I and the potato salad heard. We're trying to project a certain image today. Partner families, legacy donors, future donors. I know you work with the pantry. Keep your name tag off for the photos. No need to confuse people. Commoners ruin the shot? I asked and watched her eyes flicker. She recovered quickly. Dear, I never used that word, she said with a smile that dared me to say otherwise. People hear what they want. We say salt of the earth, and they translate it however they like. I turned to walk toward the drink coolers and walked straight into a wall of navy polo shirts and earpieces. The security team from the country club across the road had apparently been donated for the day, and one of the men was checking a clipboard. Name, he asked, bored in the way that makes people mean. Maya Rivers, I said, stepping aside so a child could reach for a cookie. He scanned the list with a finger. You're not on the guest roster for the VIP tent, he said, and spoke into his sleeve. We've got an unlisted by the sponsor area. I said I was going to the coolers, I said, and felt the old heat climb my neck again. Sir, a man behind me said in a voice that sounded theatrical and embarrassed at once, she's with me. Evan. He held up his hands like surrender. She's my guest. The security guy didn't move. He glanced at Richard, who was 20 feet away pretending to discuss baseball with the bank manager. Richard didn't look over. The guard tapped his mic, murmured something, then stepped back. "You can pass through to the general area," he said. "Sponsor areas are restricted." Evan's jaw clenched. "Dad," he called, and it came out too loud. Heads turned. Richard turned last. "What's this about?" Richard asked, already annoyed, as if traffic had been rerouted for someone who didn't matter. "They're telling Maya she can't walk by the sponsor tent," Evan said. "She brought half the food." Richard didn't look at the food. He looked at my sandals and then at Evan, and his voice went low. "This is why I said keep things separate today," he said. "We have donors here who expect a certain standard. This is not a date. This is an event. You want to help? Help. You want to play boyfriend? Do it on your own time." "I'm right here," I said. My heartbeat picked up. The sun felt hotter. I could smell cut grass and hot plastic and my own skin cooling as a cloud passed in front of the sun. A police cruiser rolled up to the curb at that exact moment, and I felt something in the air shift, the way it does when a summer storm is about to break. The officer stepped out, hand resting near his belt, not on it. His eyes scanned the tents and then landed on the security guy, who nodded toward us. "We got a call about a disturbance," the officer said in the tone you use for toddlers and drunk uncles. "Everything all right here?" "No disturbance," I said, forcing my voice steady. "Just confusion about a list." Vivian floated over on a current of perfume. "Officer," she said, face glowing like a television host. "Thank you for being here. We had a hiccup with crowd flow. Nothing serious. You know how events can get." Evan looked mortified. "This is ridiculous," he said, and he sounded like he was speaking to himself. The officer looked from him to me to Richard. He tipped his cap. "Ma'am," he said to me. "Sorry for the trouble." He nodded to the security guy. "Don't call us for list problems." Then he left, and just like that we all had to pretend the moment hadn't happened. I stood there, letting the heat roll up from the asphalt into my sandals. My throat felt dry. Vivian leaned closer with a smile like a blade. "You see?" she murmured. "What I mean about delicate. We work hard to make things smooth. When people don't know the dance, they step on toes. Which part of the dance is calling the police on the person who brought the beans?" I asked. She blinked once, slow. "That's a very dramatic way to put it," she said and turned away before I could answer. I found the water jugs and started pouring cups because doing something with my hands was better than standing still. Evan hovered, tried to take the stack from me. "I'm sorry," he said. "They're trying to make this day about their names." "I thought if they saw you helping, they'd—" "They did see," I said. "They saw a chance to prove I didn't belong." He didn't argue. For 15 minutes, we poured water. Children laughed. The guitar guy started a hymn. The pastor moved through the crowd like a current. I breathed and let the rhythm of cups splash, cups steady me. Then a woman I recognized from school board meetings stepped up, sunglasses pushed back in her hair, and lowered her voice. "You teach at East Cobb, right?" she said. "You're in those PTA pictures." I nodded. She glanced left and right and then pointed with her chin toward the sponsor tent. "You should know," she said, "they listed that pantry as a program of their foundation, but we haven't seen a check all year. My sister volunteers there, too. Every time she asks, they say it's coming. Everything is always coming with them." "Maybe the board delayed disbursements," I said, because I wanted there to be an uncomplicated explanation. She raised an eyebrow. "Maybe. Or maybe someone likes having their name on banners more than they like paying vendors. Watch the receipts on the lawn rental. They double-billed last year." She took her water and walked away, leaving me with a humming in my ears and a memory of the booklet in that hallway with the tiny print that had bothered me without telling me why. On the way to my car, I passed the recycling bins and noticed a stack of cardboard donation boxes flattened beside them. The labels were pre-printed with the foundation's logo and the pantry's name. The instructive sheet on top listed acceptable foods and a pickup schedule that didn't match the one we actually followed. The instructions ended with photograph filled boxes and tag Brookstone Promise for sponsor credit. My stomach tightened the way it does when you know exactly what someone values, and it isn't the thing they say out loud. I opened my trunk, slid in my empty bags, and shut it with more force than I needed. Evan caught up to me, breathless. "Please don't leave like this," he said. "Give me 1 week. Come to dinner next Friday." Without them. 1 week for what? I asked. My voice sounded tired even to me. 1 week for me to decide which fight I'm actually going to pick, he said, and it was the first honest thing he'd said all month. The second week came and went, and in between I graded essays about Gatsby and the American dream written by kids whose parents worked 2 jobs to afford soccer cleats. On Tuesday after PDA, I stopped at the pantry to sort cans and heard the coordinator mention that the church across town had to cancel their Wednesday distribution because donations were light. On Thursday, the local paper ran a piece about the foundation's plan to host a charity golf tournament. The photo was Vivian and Richard smiling under a banner with sponsors listed in neat rows, one of which was the company that owned half the dealerships off the interstate. Friday evening, Evan made pasta in my small kitchen and talked like a man working up to something. He rinsed dishes. I dried. He finally said, without trying to dress it up, "They told me during law school that I could date anyone I wanted and marry someone who wouldn't embarrass the guest list. They use softer words, but that's the rule." When I pushed back, they called it a phase. I'm 32. They still call it a phase. "What did you say?" I asked. "I said it's not a phase," he answered, and he meant me, but also more than me. I said I'm not going to measure my life by how it looks on a donor board. He stood very still. I watched his hands, the way they fidgeted with the towel, and thought about how people say they're choosing you, and sometimes that's true, and sometimes what they mean is they want you to approve the fight they've already picked with themselves. I told him I wasn't asking him to choose anything except to stop asking me to stand where I'm not wanted. "So don't stand there," he said, and he said it with a kind of clarity that made my chest loosen a notch. "Help me move the line." I slept badly that night, heat trapped under my windows, neighborhood dogs barking at every passing raccoon. Saturday morning, I set up tables for the pantry in the church lot, watched cars pull up in a steady stream, a mile-long line by 9. The pastor said the donations from last week's picnic were mostly photographs. I didn't ask what that meant. I already knew. By the last Saturday of the month, the yard sales started in our neighborhood, handwritten signs at intersections, folding tables loaded with lamps and old toys. I walked past a table where a woman sold stacks of last year's gala programs for $1 and bought one because I wanted to see the sponsor list, and there was the Dalton name again, twice. Under the sponsors in tiny print, a paragraph thanked the foundation's community partners, including 3 food pantries. Ours was listed with a pickup date that wasn't real. Back home, I sat at my kitchen table with the program, the church bulletin, and my notes from pantry shifts. The dates didn't match. The numbers didn't match. The story didn't match the work. I didn't set out to get anyone in trouble. I set out to tell the truth as cleanly as I could. On the first Monday of the next month, I submitted an open records request to the county for the foundation's public filings and the event permits for that Sunday picnic. I did it on my lunch break with a sandwich in one hand and my laptop balanced on a stack of ungraded papers. It took 9 minutes and cost $12. I didn't tell Evan. I didn't tell Dana. I didn't tell anyone. I hit send, closed the laptop, and went back to my classroom where 17-year-olds were arguing about whether Daisy loved Gatsby or just the way he made her feel in expensive rooms. The response came 3 days later, a PDF attached to an email that felt heavier than it should have. I opened it after school with the classroom clock ticking like a metronome. The permits were standard. The filings weren't. The foundation had listed in-kind donations to the pantry at $30,000 for the quarter. Our actual intake logs showed less than half that, and most of it had come from small donors who dropped off bags of canned vegetables, not corporate sponsors. A list of transportation expenses included payments to a luxury car service on 3 Sundays. The same Sundays volunteers had driven pickups filled with beans and rice because the promised delivery van had never appeared. There was a photo of a ribbon cutting for a pantry expansion taken in front of a hallway at the Dalton estate I recognized from the night of Vivian's dinner, complete with borrowed shelves and a banner held up by fishing line. I sat back in my chair and let the room go a little blurry. I could hear the squeak of sneakers in the hall and the hum of the air conditioner and the leftover scent of dry erase markers. Somewhere down the corridor, a kid laughed like he still believed grown-ups were going to keep their promises. I printed the filings and slid them into a folder, then put the folder in my tote bag and felt its weight against my leg all the way to my car. That night, when Evan called, I let it ring and ring until it stopped. I needed a day to figure out whether I was going to protect his feelings or protect the people who lined up at our pantry on Wednesdays with their gas tanks on E. I set the folder on my kitchen table and stared at it like it might explode. The Braves game murmured from the neighbor's window across the courtyard. A siren wailed far off on Roswell Road and then faded. My phone buzzed with a text from the pantry coordinator. "You seeing this?" Followed by a link to the foundation's new promotional video. I didn't click it. I didn't need to. On the second Tuesday after PDA, I asked for 5 minutes in the church office after our pantry shift. The pastor listened without interrupting, only nodding now and then, his hands folded on the desk. He looked tired in the way people look when they believe good should be obvious, but keep finding out it isn't. When I finished, he let out a long breath. "Do you want me to handle it?" he asked. "I want it handled," I said. "By someone who doesn't owe anyone favors." He picked up the phone. "I think we both know who that is," he said, and even though he didn't say the name, I knew he meant the same person I was going to call next, the only reporter in our county who showed up for ribbon cuttings and budget meetings with the same attention. Before I left the office, the pastor set his hand on the folder. "This will get messy," he said gently. "It already is," I said, and my voice came out small only to me. Outside, the air smelled like rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to fall. I walked to my car with the folder under my arm and didn't notice my hands were shaking until I tried to unlock the door and dropped my keys. That was the moment I let myself admit I was angry, not just at 2 parents with too much money and not enough shame, but at the way they made goodness look like a table they could reserve and control. I was angry at the casual way they used the word common and meant human. I was angry at myself for thinking I could eat dessert in their dining room and not pay for it later. I picked up the keys, got in, and turned on the radio. The local news read off the weather, a high of 82 by Saturday, chance of thunderstorms. Then the anchor mentioned the upcoming charity golf tournament, tickets available online, all proceeds to benefit food insecurity initiatives. I laughed once, a dry sound that sat wrong in my throat, and then I did the only thing that had ever steadied me when life got stupid. I made a list. Call reporter. Call pantry coordinator back. Show Evan the filings. Decide if that last item was a kindness or just a courtesy. Decide what to do when people who call you common try to call you cruel for telling the truth. Decide if kindness really was a luxury or if it was the only currency worth anything when everything else had price tags. By the time I'd finished the list, the rain finally started, a soft sheet across the windshield. I watched the drops blur the streetlights and felt my shoulders come down a little. I set my phone face down on the passenger seat so I wouldn't see whatever Vivian decided to post next. I pulled out of the church lot and headed home, 1 mile at a time, the folder buckled in beside me like a passenger I hadn't invited but couldn't ignore. On the first Wednesday of the new month, I met the reporter at a diner off Cobb Parkway that still smelled like hot griddle and bleach from the morning mop. And I set the folder between the coffee cups while a ceiling fan clicked out a slow rhythm that made the room feel like a waiting room for truth. He was younger than I expected and wore a Braves cap pulled low even indoors. And he listened the way teachers wish kids would listen, nodding without interrupting as I walked him through dates, filings, and why pantry volunteers kept showing up to empty tables while flyers bragged about record donations. He asked careful questions about who could confirm what. He wrote down the numbers with the quiet focus of someone who knew how a local story turns into a mess if you miss one tiny thing. And when I finished, he said he would need time to verify, but that the photos of the ribbon cutting in a hallway that wasn't a pantry were something else. He said it in a flat way that told me he was trying not to say outrageous on tape. He asked if he could call the pastor for comment, and I gave him the number because that man had already told me he was ready to answer like a grown-up. We walked out together into the damp parking lot, and he said the piece might run before the golf tournament if his editor thought it held up. And even though I was the one who brought him the package, I felt a strange urge to say sorry for making his week harder. I didn't tell Evan I had met the reporter, and I told myself that wasn't a betrayal because I had tried polite, private speech and been met with a smile that called me salt on a dish. On Thursday after school, my principal called me into her office, where the air always smelled like dry erase cleaner, and the blinds cut the afternoon sunlight into long, even strips. And she told me with a calm voice that she had received a call from a prominent community member who suggested I was bringing political drama into my classroom, and she said the words, "I know this is nonsense," as she slid a thin email printout toward me. But even with her support, my stomach tightened when I read Vivian's name at the bottom. My principal added that the school district lawyers would want us to be very careful about how we phrased public statements if this turned into a story, and I nodded and said that I understood how words worked because I taught them all day. And then I went back to my room and erased the whiteboard with more force than I had to while the cleaning staff's cart squeaked down the hall like a metronome for restraint. Friday morning before homeroom, the pastor called to say a congregant wanted me to meet her uncle who knew his way around nonprofit filings in the same way some folks know their way around carburetors. I drove 10 minutes after school to a small ranch house with a chain-link fence and hydrangeas trying their best in the heat, and a retired IRS agent named Mr. Whitaker opened the door wearing a short-sleeve button-down and the expression of a man who had stared at numbers long enough to know what they liked to hide. We sat at his kitchen table where the surface was clean except for a salt shaker and a jar of peppermints. And he pushed his reading glasses down his nose and took his time with each page like he was tasting soup. And when he finished, he said he couldn't give legal advice and he couldn't tell me what to do, but he could say out loud that listing luxury transport fees under community outreach and counting photographed boxes as in-kind support without matching intake logs was the sort of thing that got letters mailed with seals on the envelope. He said not to add a single adjective in public and to stick to the dates, amounts, and their own words. He said if I wanted to sleep at night, I should remember that accuracy is not cruelty and that the quiet people in a county often need someone boring to say the boring thing with. Boring evidence. I thanked him more times than felt normal, and he sent me off with a peppermint for the road like I was a kid again headed to a spelling bee. That night, Evan came by with a paper bag of grocery store sushi and the look of a person who had rehearsed hard sentences in a mirror. We ate at my coffee table because the kitchen felt too official for what he needed to say. And he told me his mother had heard things and wanted to nip gossip, and he asked if I could hold off on whatever I was planning until he had time to convince them to do a quiet fix. And he said he knew I didn't owe him that, and he understood if I was already past the point of favors. I took a breath and told him I wasn't gossiping and I wasn't plotting. I was standing in the sun with their own filings and asking them to honor the people they told the news they cared about. And I said that if his parents wanted a quiet fix, they had a full month of chances before I even sent one email. He stared down at a piece of ginger he hadn't eaten, and he said he loved his parents even when they acted like this, and he loved me for not letting him pretend this wasn't happening, and I believed him, which made the next part harder when he said he might need to step back from me for a beat while he tried to push them towards something that looked like accountability without using that word. And I nodded because I didn't need a partner for the next week so much as I needed steady feet and a voice that didn't shake when someone tried to tap the microphone and change the subject. On Saturday, the yard sales came back to life along my route to the laundromat. Faded signs pointing to cul-de-sacs where kids sold lemonade for $1 and dads haggled over power tools. And at one table I found an old church directory that made me smile because faces looked younger and nothing else felt too different. Sunday after service, the pastor asked to make a brief announcement and said the pantry would be moving its Wednesday distribution to the rec center because we needed space for an anticipated crowd, and he didn't say why, but several people turned to me with questions in their faces, and I kept my eyes on my bulletin. That afternoon, the reporter texted to confirm details and to ask if I would go on camera. I said I would speak on record with my name because I wasn't hiding, but he could keep me off camera if it helped keep the story on the filings and not my face. He said he respected that and asked if I had any photos from the pantry that could contrast with the expansion photos, and I sent him shots of our crowded Wednesday line from the last week's shift where 100 cars wrapped the block by 10, and none of it was dramatic, just steady and sad and normal. Monday morning before first bell, an envelope slid under my classroom door like it was shy, and inside was a letter from a law firm downtown that used expensive paper and long sentences to say short things, and the short thing was stop talking or else. I sat at my desk and read it twice, feeling my fingers go cold even though the room was warm, and then I walked it down to the principal, who read it with her mouth pulled into a straight line and asked if she could send it to the district office. By lunch, I had a message from the district council telling me that as a private citizen on my own time, I had the right to report facts, and he advised me to keep my statements limited to what I could prove with documents. And I wanted to laugh, even though it wasn't funny, because that had been my plan from the first minute. After school, I stopped at the pantry to help label boxes, and the coordinator told me a sponsor had tried to drop off branded hats instead of rice. And we both stared at the hats like they were a bad joke, and we put them in a bag for the thrift store because someone would want them, and we weren't going to waste any kind of help even if the help came wrapped in a banner. On the second Wednesday after PDA, the reporter called to say his editor had greenlit the piece for Friday night, and they would be contacting the foundation for comment that afternoon. Less than an hour later, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't know that turned out to be Vivian, asking if we could meet like adults to avoid a scene that would help no one, and she suggested a private room at a club that required a jacket. And I wrote back that I would meet at the rec center near the basketball hoops because that was where this lived. Her reply said that was inappropriate for a conversation of this sensitivity, and my next message said I wasn't sensitive, I was practical. And we could talk next to the shelf with canned beans if she wanted. She didn't respond for 2 hours, and then she wrote that she would come by at 4 on the dot and bring their documentation. And I said fine and texted the coordinator to expect a visit so no one would be startled by a silk blouse. In a gym. The gym smelled like floor cleaner and rubber, and Vivian walked in with Richard half a step behind and a leather folio held to her chest like a shield. I introduced them to the coordinator by first names because full titles felt silly in a room with a scoreboard that still had last year's homecoming score stuck on it, and Vivian asked if we could move somewhere private. And I said the bleachers were fine because everyone here was polite and had seen worse than a tense conversation. We sat and she opened the folio to show glossy photos of donation drives and letters from sponsors that praised their family's generosity, and I nodded and said those were nice and the photos printed well. And then I set the filings and the county permits and the intake logs beside them and pointed to dates that didn't match and amounts that inflated like hot dough. I said I wouldn't use any words beyond the numbers and the labels that they chose, and I asked them if they wanted to provide corrected versions before the news called the state charity office for a statement, and Richard's jaw worked like he was chewing a tough bite, and Vivian's chin lifted in that way it did when she needed height. She said I was making a mountain out of a bad receipt, and that every organization had clerical errors, and that this was a political hit paid for by people who didn't like their influence. And I said the pantry didn't have the budget for politics and that our influence looked like bags of rice sitting in cars while kids waited with the AC off. And I told her I had no interest in her name, only in whether the numbers going on the local news matched the boxes in the storage room. She leaned back and told me I didn't understand how philanthropy worked and that leveraging visibility mattered as much as checks because awareness brought more donations. And then she made the mistake of saying the quiet part out loud by admitting that sometimes the photo happened before the rail help arrived because optics bought time, and I said community doesn't live on time bought with pictures. It lives on groceries that show up before the milk turns, and I watched as a flush climbed from her collarbones to her cheeks. Richard asked for copies like he was doing us a favor by pretending to engage, and I handed him a manila envelope with printouts and a one-page timeline that I had typed cleanly without adjectives. He flipped through it and said their lawyers would be in touch. And I said they already were, and their letter was in my school inbox along with a note from the district council reminding me to stay factual, and Vivian stood and smoothed her blouse like she was erasing creases from air, and she said they would be issuing a statement that corrected misimpressions and reminded people of their decades of giving, and I said statements were free and rice cost money, and I was done trading one for the other. The reporter's request for comment went out at 2. By 6, a PR email landed in my inbox that praised the foundation's visionary leadership and blamed seasonal variance for any mismatches at 8. Evan showed up at my door looking like he had run a mile in dress shoes, and he said the statement made him sick, and he had tried to get them to include a correction promise, but they wouldn't because they were afraid admitting anything would draw attention. And he asked me in a tired voice not to burn it all down before he could get them to make real amends, and I told him in an equally tired voice that I wasn't burning. I was pulling a fire alarm for a building that had been smoking all month. And he put his head in his hands and said he didn't know how to stand between me and them without getting flattened, and for once I didn't try to tell him it would be okay because that wasn't mine to promise. Friday before the tournament, the local news trailer parked on the edge of the church lot where we moved distribution for space, and the camera guy wiped sweat from his forehead while the anchor shook hands like she did this every day because she did. The piece ran at 6 with my voice explaining the dates while the camera panned over the pantry line and then cut to Vivian and Richard in a polished clip from their PR team saying words that didn't answer the numbers. The reporter's editor kept the tone even and let the documents fill the screen, and after it aired, my phone filled with messages from parents who thanked me and from numbers I didn't recognize that told me to mind my own business. And I turned the phone face down and kept loading boxes into trunks. Halfway through the line, a woman rolled down her window and handed me a small envelope with 2 singles and a handful of quarters, and she whispered that it wasn't much, but it was honest. And I nodded because there was nothing else to say that would fit in that moment. Late that night, the pastor texted that the Attorney General's Charity Division had called him for copies of the same documents and that he had sent them, and then he added a question I knew was really a warning. asking if I planned to be at the tournament in the morning because the country club was private and the mood would be hot. I wrote back that I had no plans to crash anything and that I was not the story, and he replied with a small understood. That felt like a blessing and a caution. Wrapped together, I tried to sleep and couldn't because adrenaline buzzed under my skin like static, so I watched highlights from the Braves game on my phone with the sound off until my eyes got heavy. And when I woke up the next morning, the sky had the flat white look it gets before a storm, and I thought about how weather reports can be right about the big picture while getting the hour wrong, and I poured coffee and waited for my hands to stop trembling. Midday Saturday, the tournament rolled on across a perfect expanse of grass with polite applause and white tents, and in the early afternoon, the reporter texted that a second piece would air that night with reaction from donors. By late afternoon, word started to leak that two of the big sponsors had pulled their names off the banner until an audit could be done. And at 5, I got a voicemail from a number I recognized as Vivian's assistant asking if I could meet Sunday after service to discuss a way forward that would honor everyone, and I sat with that phrase because it was the first time anyone near them had said honor in a way that didn't sound like press release foam. I called back and said I would be at the church parking lot at noon and they could bring whatever they meant by honor. That evening, I walked around my apartment in small circles while the game on my neighbor's TV bled through the wall like an old memory, and I thought about the price of this month, the nights of poor sleep, the way my students watched me a little too closely, the way Evan stood in doorways like a person deciding which room meant breathing. I didn't feel triumphant, just steady and tired and braced. I washed dishes that weren't dirty and wiped down counters that were already clean, and when I finally sat down, the room felt too quiet without the hum of a printer or the rustle of papers, and I made myself a grilled cheese I didn't want and ate it anyway because it felt like a small, normal thing on a day when nothing else was normal. Sunday morning, I wore a dress that didn't look like armor, and I stood during hymns with my voice thinner than usual, and after the benediction, I walked out into the hot light of the parking lot where the air smelled like tar and fresh-cut grass, and there, beside the news van that idled under a tree because the crew had decided to tape reaction after service, Vivian and Richard waited with faces that were tight around the mouth and eyes that did not know how to be soft in public, and when they saw me, they walked over not with confidence, but with the careful steps of people who knew the ground had shifted under their feet. I took a breath and met them halfway because this was going to happen regardless. And Vivian lifted a hand as if to stop an argument that I hadn't started, and she said they were ready to make an arrangement, and the way she said arrangement made me think of tables and guest lists and who sits where. But I stayed quiet and waited for the arrangement to be real, and then she did something I had not expected to see at all when she looked at me and asked for time in a voice that sounded almost like a plea. Vivian stood too straight for a parking lot and said they wanted time to reconcile paperwork, call vendors, line up an independent review that would show context, and she said the word like it could wash numbers clean. Richard stared past my shoulder toward the news van, his mouth tight, and when he finally looked at me, his voice was lower than I'd ever heard it as he said that reputations in this county took decades to build and minutes to wreck, and that I wouldn't want a mistake to cost people their jobs. I told him no one here was talking about jobs. We were talking about food and honesty, and I reminded them that they were the ones who called us common, not the other way around, and that if they wanted mercy, it had to look like something you could taste and count. "Tell us what you want," Vivian said, and the way she clasped her hands told me she knew I wasn't bluffing anything because I didn't have to. The paper did the work. The air was hot and smelled like tar and cut grass, and I felt sweat slide down my back even though I wasn't moving, and I watched her eyes because that was where the fight lived. "I want restitution for the shortfall this quarter paid to the pantry and the 2 others you list," I said, steady and slow so I wouldn't add adjectives. "I want a public apology today where you say the words 'we made errors' and 'we are stepping aside.'" And I want that apology outside the church where your banners usually go so the same people who come for boxes hear it. I want you off the board while the audit runs. I want the golf money held in a separate account controlled by the churches and the rec center, not your foundation. I want your next newsletter to list volunteer sign-up links instead of your family's photo, and I want a scholarship fund set up at the high school for kids who stock our shelves every Wednesday, administered by the district. Not you. You may keep your names off that last part if you prefer, but not off the apology. Richard swallowed like the words went down rough. Vivian blinked hard twice. You're asking us to dismantle our work, she said, voice thin. I'm asking you to admit it wasn't what you said it was, I answered. And to make people whole. Richard stepped forward, the leather on his shoes scuffing a little on the gravel, and his voice cracked on the first word like a man who didn't like the sound of pleading, but knew it was the only instrument left. Please, he said, and it was almost a whisper. Give us 48 hours. We will cut checks. We'll write the apology. We'll suspend the board. Just don't do it on camera with those people waiting to clip it for the 6 o'clock. I didn't call the van, I said. They're here for church reaction. They will ask you either way. If you want mercy, do it where you hurt people, in public. My heart thumped hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I rubbed my palms on my dress so they wouldn't shine. Vivian looked at her husband and then at me, and whatever calculation she was running in her head met the math of the last week, and she reached out and touched my forearm like I might be the only thing holding up the sky. Her voice lost the polish and landed where human lives live. Please, she said. Have mercy. It wasn't a line for a camera. It came out too raw for that. We will do it. We will do all of it. Don't take my son with us when you push. She glanced toward the church doors as if Evan might appear and break in two. He's not a pawn, I said. He's a man. He'll decide where to stand. I turned my head when I heard footsteps and, like she'd conjured him, there he was jogging across the lot, Ty Askew, hair damp at the temples, breath uneven like he'd run the last mile. He stopped a few feet away and looked from me to his parents, his face white around the edges. What's happening, he said, not a question so much as a request for someone to tell the truth out loud. I did, quickly and without dressing it up. When I finished, he dragged a hand over his face and let out a breath. Do it, he told them, voice flat. Stop acting like you can finesse this. Do it now. You owe these people an apology and you owe them the money. Then you go home and you sit with what you did. Vivian stared at him as if he'd switched languages. Richard looked like someone had reached inside his pocket and taken something he'd always counted on. I didn't move. The news crew saw us and drifted closer, not too close, not rude, just enough to catch it if something happened worth catching. The pastor stood a few feet behind them, hands in his pockets, gaze steady. I could hear the highway beyond the trees, a low hum, and a bird kept shouting from the light pole like this was just another Sunday, with weather and small crises. Vivian lifted her chin, closed her eyes once, opened them, and said she would speak. We didn't walk far. We stood by the curb next to the spot where the foundation usually put a banner announcing the next drive. She asked the anchor for 30 seconds and got a minute. She said the words, "We made errors and I am stepping aside and we are making restitution," without flinching or adding frosting. And when she said, "To the families we claimed to champion and to the volunteers we used as props, I am sorry." Her voice broke just enough to be true. Richard tried to add a sentence about intention and stopped when she put a hand on his arm, and then he nodded and said, "We're sorry," in a tone that didn't sound like him at all. The anchor asked about timelines and Vivian said checks by Wednesday at noon, audit board named by Friday, scholarship paperwork delivered to the district office by the following Tuesday, and the pastor said he would hold them to it because that was his job. The reporter didn't make it a scene. He recorded it like a weather update and moved on. When the camera crew rolled their gear away, Vivian turned to me with eyes that looked as if she'd finally been awake for the first time in a month. "Thank you," she said, and it startled me because I expected anger or spin and got something that felt like relief soaked in salt. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you not to forget what you asked for. Make sure we do it." "I don't plan to forget," I said. "Not because I want to keep you down. Because I want to sleep." She nodded once. Richard's mouth twitched like he'd say more and didn't. They left without drama, got into a car that seemed too quiet for how loud the day felt, and drove out past the news van without honking like people who finally understood they'd lost the right to any noise. Evan and I stood there in the heat until the air conditioner units behind the church kicked on and gave us a reason to step aside. My legs felt unsteady. My mouth was dry. He reached for my hand and stopped, then put both his hands on the rail beside us and stared at the asphalt like it held an answer printed small. "I didn't imagine it going like that," he said, voice low. "I thought it would be louder." "Loud is easy," I said. "This is harder. Now comes the part with receipts and waiting." "I know," he said, and then he looked up. "I don't know what we are after this." He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a person talking through a bruise. "I don't either," I said. "I know I don't want to be a weapon. I know you can't live split between two houses forever. I know I care about you and I care about this place, and I can't pick one without losing more than I can carry right now." He nodded and didn't push. "Then let's not pick today," he said. "Let's do the work and see if there's still a table." The next days moved like concrete hardening, slow, then suddenly set. By Wednesday at 11:30, the pantry coordinator texted me a photo of a cashier's check pinned to a corkboard with a pushpin and a note from the interim treasurer that used the word restitution without quotes. At noon, the pastor called to say the other two pantries had received theirs. Thursday, a retired accountant and a school social worker and a small business owner stood in the fellowship hall and introduced themselves as the new audit board, and none of them wore silk and none of them cared about cameras, and they asked for receipts and they got them. Friday afternoon, the district office called my principal to confirm receipt of a check for the scholarship fund with a memo line that said student pantry volunteers. And we both cried a little on the phone because it felt like a thing that had weight and would last through a few storms. Saturday, the golf tournament banner hung without two sponsor names, and the fairway looked the same anyway, and nobody starved because two logos stayed home. Vivian emailed a formal resignation letter that read like a document and not a performance. She asked the churches to announce a volunteer drive instead of a gala. Richard sent a message to donors that didn't ask for grace so much as promise open books. The Attorney General's office sent notices that they were reviewing the filings, and nobody cheered because it wasn't that kind of day. We just kept stocking shelves and tightening lines. On the third Wednesday after PDA, when a woman pulled up with 3 kids in the back and a dog's nose pressed to the window, she rolled it down and told me the cans we'd given her last week stretched 2 dinners because she made soup with rice, and I wrote rice on a sticky note and stuck it to my steering wheel so I would remember even if I didn't remember my own dinner. Evan and I took a walk that Sunday after the second service, the one where the choir sings a little slower, and we didn't hold hands because it felt like we needed our arms free. He told me his parents had invited him to the house to discuss rebuilding, and he said he would go with a list and a timer and the understanding that family was not a unit you fixed in one sitting. I told him if he needed me to wait, I could wait, but I couldn't pause my life, and he said he would never ask me to. Stop showing up where I showed up first. We passed a yard sale where someone had set a box of baseball cards marked $5 next to a stack of old church bulletins. And I bought the bulletins for $0.25 because the woman running the table said her late husband liked saving them, and I carried them home for my mother because it felt like a promise kept in a month full of broken ones. The news moved on by the end of the month because that's how local news works. Schools started talking about homecoming and the choir switched to fall songs and the rec center started registration for the youth basketball league. And the pantry line shortened by a few cars because the checks didn't just land. They turned into rice and beans and fresh produce thanks to a local farm that called after the story and asked how to help without a photograph. The scholarship committee met in the library and argued about requirements like adults do when they care. And the principal said we would pick 2 students before Thanksgiving and surprise them at a pep rally so they'd get a good loud moment in a month that would otherwise be quiet. I graded short stories at my kitchen table while the Braves game murmured through the wall and the dog upstairs barked at something only he could hear, and my phone buzzed at reasonable hours instead of midnight with drama. And I slept with the window cracked because the night finally cooled. I saw Vivian once more before the month ended, on a Saturday morning at the rec center where the audit board had set up a card table with a sign that said, "Questions answered." And she arrived with a box of plain t-shirts for volunteers and stood in the doorway like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to come in. I walked over, and she handed me the box without ceremony, and she thanked me again. Not with a speech, but with a quiet "please take care of this county" kind of thanks. She looked smaller, without the event hair and the camera makeup, and she didn't try to add a sentence about intention or enemies or gossip. She asked if she could come pack boxes one Wednesday without anyone making a fuss. I told her it was a long line and spare hands were welcome and fuss was a waste of oxygen. She smiled in a way that looked like the start of something manageable and not a project, and she signed the volunteer sheet with simple letters and no titles. Evan and I didn't put a label on anything that day or the next. He came with me to the pantry and taped box seams and made small talk with people who didn't care about his last name. And sometimes when we were side by side our elbows touched and sometimes we moved in separate lanes because that's how it was for now. One evening he came over with a bag of groceries and cooked soup that tasted like a good try. And we ate it at the kitchen table with the window open and the announcer talking about a double down the line somewhere else, and when he left he kissed my cheek like we were at the beginning again and not the middle of a correction, and we didn't promise anything big because promises had been the problem all month. The last Thursday before payday I stood in the church hall with the pastor and the audit board and a dozen volunteers, and we looked at the stacks of boxes ready for the morning, and I felt a clean kind of tired. The kind that comes from lifting rather than arguing. I thought about the first night in that dining room with all the glass and the menu cards and the word common sliding across the table like a joke that isn't one. And I thought about the parking lot and the word mercy spoken without polish and about how revenge in stories always sounds neat, but in real life it looks like a list and a long week and a check pinned to a corkboard. I didn't feel like a victor. Just a person who had asked for what was due and kept asking until the asking worked. When I locked my apartment that night and set my phone face down on the counter, I could smell the faint soap from dinner and the clean cotton of a folded stack of laundry. The world didn't tilt or swell. It stayed where it was, and so did I. I lay down and listened to the building breathe, the elevator cables, the neighbor's TV, a car a few blocks away with a loud bass turning the corner, and I let my shoulders settle. Mercy isn't forgetting, and it isn't silence. It's a way to let people make right what they made wrong without pretending it never happened, and that's what I gave them because that's what I wanted for myself. That's not a headline, but it's a life I can carry, and sometimes that's the only victory you need.